Great. So everyone, welcome to tonight's program on Setsuko Hara, Japan's Garbo. Although as we go through this presentation, we will see that she is a lot more than just the reputations that she has had and the kind of enigmatic reputation that she has garnered in her years since her retirement. And I do, as I was talking about the Oscars earlier, it is kind of a happy coincidence that I am presenting this a program on a Japanese actress, an Asian actress who very recently has gotten a lot more attention and acclaim in the West. The day after we saw the Oscars award the first Asian woman for Best Actress, and I believe only the third Asian woman to win any acting award in the 95-year history. I should just note, in some defense of the Oscars, by the time Setsuko Hara's big films got over to the United States, it was the 70s and she had retired from acting, wouldn't have been eligible for any kind of an acting award. But if you're familiar with her name at all, it might be because Turner Classic Movies, about 2 summers ago when they did Summers Under the Stars, Setsuko Hara was one of the performers that they highlighted. And since then, especially being to social media, there have been a lot more people going like, oh, wow, I've never seen this film called Tokyo Story or Late Autumn. I should see more of this woman's work, or just try to find out more about her, which is kind of hard for 2 reasons. One, she was an intensely private person. And 2, there have been books written about her. However, they have not been translated into English. There actually is one book called The Truth About Setsuko Hara. It was published in 2020, and it has yet to get a, I don't know who I have to ask to get that translated into English. Luckily, the website nippon.com does publish interviews with, did publish an interview with this writer in English. So there are some stories that we have from her post-retirement career. All right. So as I said before, an actress, and if we're just talking about in the West, she is probably the most well-known Japanese actress to ever come out of Japan. I don't think that is saying much, considering I think if you were to ask the average person on the street, oops, go back, they wouldn't be able to name any actors from Japan. They'd probably just say there's Toshiro Mifune, and that's probably because they know the 7 Samurai, and maybe they would get Setsuko Hara, and that is likely if they are aficionados of Japanese cinema. Don't ever bother asking an anime fan about actual Japanese cinema. They won't know. Not actually, I'm going to say this as a fan of animation. Not that animated films in Japan aren't cinema, but I think there is a very big difference between the anime series that we see on television and the actual animated features that come out of Japan. One is what Guillermo del Toro and Scorsese would call cinema. Others made Hayao Miyazaki say anime was a mistake. But she's also well regarded in Japan. And in her career, which lasted almost 30 years, she had over 100 roles. I believe it was 113 to be exact. So very busy actress. Probably best known in the United States as one of a staple of Yasujiro Ozu's films. Yasujiro Ozu is a director who probably could have a program on his own work. Actually, speaking of someone who worked about 30 years and had a very prolific output, Ozu was one. She also had a moniker of the Eternal Virgin, which we will get to, and she was considered Japan's Greta Garbo because of her abrupt retirement and her almost immediate just withdrawal from public life. So early life for Setsuko Hara. She was born in 1920 in Yokohama, Japan. So Setsuko Hara, I mean, like a lot of actors in the United States, not her real name. Her real name is Masai Aida, or in Japan, it would be Aida, not Aida. It's more of an, Todd, you're actually better at Japanese pronunciation. Would it be Ada?
I think it would be Ida, but I could be wrong.
Ida, okay. Well, so Japan doesn't have a hard A. So if you were to say like manga, they don't have that. It's a manga, so it would be like an Ida. So do not default to me on that pronunciation. She came from a very wealthy family, Japan, and kind of looked to be on track to get sort of go to a finishing school, marry off a nice a nice man who's also in her family's social strata. Because her dad, silk wholesaler, and if you know anything about the Japanese economy and what silk was used for in terms of kimonos, dresses, it was a very, high class fabric. It was also sold to people who were a little bit more economically downtrodden, but made the family very comfortable. And even she, as the youngest of 7 children, really wanted for nothing in her early years. However, like many other places in the world, the 1929 crash took a toll on her father's business and subsequently the family's wealth. And she actually stars in a movie that kind of somewhat mirrors this situation later in her life. So she only had formal schooling until the age of 14 before she went to become an actress. But this wasn't a case of, young Setsuko Hara at age 7 performing, or as last year's March program, Ida Lupido performing with her family, wanting to be on stage. This was one where her brother-in-law, one of her older sisters, Hisatora Kumagi, or we'll just know him as Kumagi going forward, he encouraged her to get into acting, not as a way to really, pursue a passion, but this is a good way to support the family. And as you can see by this photo, she's the very, attractive young woman there, and the film industry in Japan was burgeoning at that point, and roles for these plucky young ingenues were available. And so he not only encouraged her to get into acting, he very quickly acted as her manager, which, we know anything about a lot of industries where young people go into it, it's very good she had an older person there to be like, offer her some protection. So her early career is, it's not one that isn't highlighted much, much of it because most of her early works we can't see. They're either, some of them are lost to time at this point, or lost to damage and the degradation of film, or just no one knows where they are, no one knows where the rights are. Other ones, as we'll get to, are a little controversial as to the subject matter. So her debut was Do Not Hesitate in 1935, kind of a bit role. She's not the lead, but she makes an impression. And she's later spotted by director Sadao Yamanaka, and he casts her in Priest of Darkness, which is her first real high-profile film. So Do Not Hesitate is like kind of a small, low-budget movie. It's not by a big-name director. It kind of gets her seen. But Priest of Darkness is the one where she gets noticed. And, because she has this screen presence, she has this very attractive oval face, a very, a high-pitched voice, not squeaky, but in Japan, women are kind of, at the time, were encouraged to kind of speak highly and softly, sort of a way to show their submissiveness, but also it was just this is an attractive way for women to present themselves. And it was also a sign of a high class status. So, we see this across the world, the idea of the people from the higher classes are more refined. They speak slower, they have a higher vocabulary, they enunciate, versus the people who are not tend to be a little gruffer. People have this idea, they swear more, they use slang. It's just, again, something it's all over the world, no matter what country you go, and there's some version of it. So she becomes a very in-demand actress. And in 1937, she goes to Europe and she goes to Germany. So this is because, if you're familiar with World War II history, Germany and Japan formed an alliance, and because neither of them were doing very great things in the 1930s. And let's not get too depressing because we're here to learn about film. if I wanted to get depressing in terms of Japanese film history, we'd go back to my atomic cinema program. But their alliance led to collaborations with film because Germany not even had a fledgling film industry, had an established film industry. Most countries in Europe were established, whereas Japan was in the past decade starting to get off the ground. So they're just like, hey, we're going to send her over there to be an ambassador to us. So if you look on the right, that is a picture of Setsuko Hara right next to the Nazi Minister of Propaganda, Joseph Goebbels. And again, as I note here, there has never been any evidence that Hara ever endorsed the actions of the Nazis. She was also 17 at the time. But it is something to mention because there were definitely anti-Semitism was and is global. In fact, there have been anime recently that have come under fire for having some anti-Semitic tropes in it. And there were people, not so much in the film industry, but there were people in Japan and other industries who were very enthusiastic to work with the Nazis and definitely did not disagree with a lot of their rhetoric. But there's never been any evidence that Hara bought into that. But what Hara did buy into and did notice and did want to bring back with her when she went back to Japan was what she found in Europe, because she met the saying here, Jean Renoir, and she kind of saw like, oh, these directors who see their actors and these writers as people to collaborate with rather than just ruling over with an iron fist. The way Japanese cinema had been at that point was many directors, it was kind of an assembly line thing. There were directors who had more of an artistic vision, but there were others who just kind of had egos and saw the actors, the writers, the crew as, we're just here to get something done as quickly as possible. So this quote is from Taeko Ishii. She's the writer of the book, The Truth About Setsuko Hara. Quote, in Europe, filmmakers were seen as artists and women were valued. And all of the people she met who worked in films were intellectual and cultivated, which made a deep impression on her, as they were very different from their counterparts in Japan. Women were treated as inherently inferior to men in Japanese society, and films were looked down on as beneath modern theater and kabuki. She really felt that Japanese film sets were full of ill-mannered types, and that might also be because of her background and her social status, but wondered if they could become the UFA's Babelsberg studio in Berlin or Hollywood. So the other thing to note is how women were treated. And, if you know much, Japan still had, and still does in many ways, have some patriarchal notions about women's place in society. And that was true until the end of World War II, and the American occupation brought a little bit more of a modern view of women into the country. And with that, Setsuko Hara's wish for a film industry that valued art and valued women was about to come to pass. So her post-war career is where Setsuko Hara really starts to shine as a performer. So she was already very well known and almost beloved as, again, the young teen ingenue. But, 1945, she's 25 years old, and she she is trying to find her place in the new film world, and she's actually very excited for what this is. She's like, oh, there are these new directors. We're no longer making propaganda films anymore. So she's seeing that there might be hope for what she had had initially in the 30s. Oops, sorry, I was about to say there is someone whose mic is on, if that could be silenced. So here are just a sample of roles that kind of define both Hara's next chapter in life, but also as they relate to Japan. Actually, before I get to that, a little bit of background. So if we all know the history of World War II, after the defeat of Japan, VJ Day, the United States military occupied the country. But they didn't just occupy the country. The emperor, in what was a groundbreaking move, spoke via radio to the people. Before that, that wasn't something that was done. The emperor was seen almost as a god on earth. So that was a change. This idea of this ruler who had been seen as almost a deity was now just a normal person. And Japanese citizens were grappling with that change and kind of having to adjust to that. The Constitution was also rewritten to be a lot more modern. And again, more participation for women, trying to bring more modern ideas to the forefront and as this country went forward. So again, Hara, according to her biographer, actually was extremely excited for this because she's like, again, finally, I will no longer be this damsel who just had to, sit and wait for her man to come home from war. I am going to be like, I can actually have more choice. So this is actually from a professor, Yuka Kano, and she is comparing, contrasting her wartime career with her post-war career. Quote, almost immediately after her debut, Hara developed, wrong one, sorry. Okay. The Daughter of the Samurai catapulted Setsuko Hara into fame, which led to her appearing in propaganda films during World War II. The image she presented of, quote, a woman stoically bearing hardship at home while soldiers went off to war took hold, earning Setsuko Hara the title of the goddess on the home front. But that image changed dramatically once the war ended. As national sentiment trended towards women's liberation, she frequently played bright, assertive, and independent women. Eventually, Hara became known as the goddess of post-war democracy. And it was probably Akira Kurosawa's No Regrets for Our Youth and Tadashi Imani's I, Sanmyaku that solidified this image. So two of those films that were mentioned, I Sanmyaku was 1945. So Hara plays a Tokyo teacher, gets transferred to a rural town, and she has a lot of modern ideas about what women can do, women being able to choose their own path in life, choose their own partners. And this puts her at odds with the more traditional conservative rural town. And you can look at that as a microcosm to the macrocosm of what was a very conservative Japanese country dealing with a more modern influence of American society and just more modern values. Ball at the Anjou House, as I had mentioned earlier, is one that is very interesting considering Hara's background. So she plays the youngest daughter of a formerly prominent family that loses their mansion, not to a global economic crash, but to the post-war reforms where a lot of these very wealthy landowners had to get rid of a lot of their land because the state saw it as like, you can't hoard acres and acres and acres and just keep it. So her character is kind of trying to go like, how do I deal with no longer being like the daughter of a manor? And while the character of her brother seems to be very angsty and almost suicidal, feeling like he has lost his place in society and his will to live. And also keep in mind, suicide is viewed very differently in Japan than in here, especially back then. This is not an endorsement of that in any way. But her character, Atsuko, is like, we need to find peace with this new world and go forward. And the most famous of her immediate post-war career is her film with Akira Kurosawa, which is No Regrets for Our Youth. Akira Kurosawa is likely the most famous Japanese director in America. The man did The Seven Samurai. Rashomon was Rashomon the first film to win a special Oscar for an international feature, or was it just the first Japanese film?
I want to say it was the first in general, but let me take a quick look to verify.
Yeah. And he also directed The Seven Samurai, which I think you could argue was the blueprint for every modern action film and even every modern blockbuster film. Also, if you are a Star Wars fan, Kurosawa directed a little film called The Hidden Fortress, which did make its way over to the United States and was seen by people like young George Lucas, who were like, hey, this is a neat plot. What if this took place in space? So, groundbreaking filmmaker, but his work with Setsuko Hara is not as well known, probably because his samurai films or films like Ron, his dramas like Ikiru are more well known. He also, as a director, truly did come into his own in the 1950s. But No Regrets for Our Youth is one of the standouts of early Kurosawa. So Hara is Yukie, who is the daughter of an anti-fascist professor, she meets an activist student while she's at an anti-military rally, and it also takes place during the course of World War II. So it also tracks the radical and sort of the burgeoning democratic movement in Japan. So the idea of democracy, the idea of more liberal ideas did not entirely come from America when it came in 1940, because by then they had access to Western thought or just political theory from around the world. It's also worth noting, for a while there was the idea in Japan that in terms of the war effort, there was just monolithic support. There was no dissent at all. Every Japanese citizen was just behind the war. That is 100% not true. There was always opposition to the war. And as it went on, and the citizens of Japan were starting to just be economically decimated, anti-militarism grew. And there were also rumors of what was happening overseas that there were a lot of citizens not happy with. And a number of creators who were conscripted into either fighting in the war, like Ishiro Honda, or just making war propaganda like Kurosawa himself, they do not look back on that period with pride. Actually, Hara's brother-in-law, he was very supportive of the war effort, and he was isolated from Japanese film industry from a while post-war, because a lot of the creators who came out of that were, let's just say, not a fan of that position. So Hara teaming up with Kurosawa is really, I don't want to say her star-making role, but the star-making role of the second half of her career. And thankfully, No Regrets for Our Youth is available. It's a great look at early Kurosawa, early Setsuko Hara. It's also a good look if you want to get some kind of insight into a very politically tumultuous time in Japan, and I think a lot more nuanced than the picture we were given of Japan during wartime when at least I was in school. It is also notable that this was the only film that had a female protagonist from Kurosawa. Not that he couldn't write women well, he absolutely could, but in terms of them having the starring role and being the protagonist, Setsuko Hara is the only one to fit that role. So now we come to the collaboration she is most known for, her collaboration with Yasujiro Ozu. And as I said earlier, Ozu is a director who, I mean, Todd, we could make this a program on all of our own. We'd have to go watch all of his movies, the ones that we
it's a prolific career.
Prolific career, and unlike some other Japanese filmmakers, there is a bulk of his early films that have been saved. Because he was considered just such an icon in Japan, there was an effort to just preserve his work. Some of his early stuff is gone, but a good amount of his work, even his silent films, have survived. Once again, everybody, film preservation is very important.
By the way, to follow up on your earlier question, Rashomon wasn't the first, but it was the first Japanese winner.
Okay, I knew it was one of the two. Made a huge splash, and we'll actually come back to Rashomon. Just wait. So again, with that slate of films and Kurosawa, a directing star on the rise, Hara was already a big star in 1940. Americans have the idea that she didn't become a star until she collaborated with Ozu. Not quite the case. In Japan, she was already, I mean, what would the equivalent for her be? I want to say like a Julia Roberts American Sweetheart, but she's so reserved in her performances. Julia Roberts doesn't seem to fit. Maybe a Sally Field?
That's a maybe, actually.
Yeah, maybe. I mean, she was like again, I think kind of Japan's sweetheart would fit for it. But Ozu is what really, I think, launched her to icon status. Went from being well-known actress who prolific career, every director wanted to work with her. She was also very easy to work with and very friendly, to the point where some people thought that she was too friendly. Going back to Professor Kano, she said, Hara developed almost immediately after her debut, Hara developed a close friendship with a hair and makeup artist named Sake Nakao, and their relationship continued even after Hara retired. But apparently there was talk of how incomprehensible it was that a movie in the movie business for a major star to be so close to ordinary staff. But as this professor says, I find it quite telling of the kind of person that Setsuko Hara was. So despite being from a higher class than potentially some of the people she worked with, she was someone who was friendly and was very good at forming connections with people. And actually the fact that she was so friendly and could form connections with people was what got her brother-in-law back into the good graces of the film industry eventually. So she works with Ozu, and her debut is a film called Late Spring. It is a film about modern Japan, and it is a plot that I think, looking at it in 2023 might seem a little strange, but we also have to keep in mind when this was made. So it is about a young woman named Noriko. She's 27 years old, and she rejects marriage in favor of caring for her widowed father. Actually, considering now there are a lot of people living at home and kind of acting as, number one, to save money, but number two, to be caregivers for aging parents. There is some of this that I think resonates more now. But the idea, in Japan, it's changed a little bit now, but for a while there was this idea that if a woman didn't marry by 25, that was it, life was over. She would actually be called a Christmasukeki. So in Japan, not a Christian country, but they do celebrate Christmas. But they had the whole thing of, oh, you can't eat Christmas cake after the 25th. It's bad after that. So that's where the Christmas cake insult comes from. So, but women weren't just being married off at the age of 17 anymore. There was the idea of you can go to school, you could maybe have a career. Hara herself was someone who probably would have been married off at age 20, but instead she went and had a very successful film career. So in the character of Noriko, while we might see a woman choosing between caring for her widowed father versus getting married to be like, what kind of a repressive choice is that? The fact that this is a woman rejecting marriage, which was something that was just so expecting at the time, it presents this choice. It presents this character as a woman who has agency and pushes back against the people in her family saying, but you need to get married. Her going, no, I don't want this. In the end, the character of Noriko does end up getting married because her father ends up getting married. But there is a discussion with her dad towards the end where she says, part of me is just scared what's going to happen if I go out there and try to find something new. And the father's says, it is scary, but you have to be brave. And that is a through line we see with a lot of Ozu's films. While he gets the reputation of being a somewhat conservative director, a lot of his films do grapple with Japanese families trying to basically reconcile the traditional world of the past with the new world of the future. But they always come down on the side of, as scary as it is, as much as we may not understand or we may be fearful, we do have to go forward. We have to embrace the future. And this would be the first of 6 films that she made with Ozu and the first of the Noriko trilogy. And so what I'm going to show is a clip from Late Spring where she is having a conversation with her father. So one of the things that comes up in this film is the concept of an arranged marriage. In America, we hear the term arranged marriage and we think of, the best example would be the joke on The Simpsons of Apu and his wife being betrothed at age 5. In Japan, the term is arranged marriage, but it is really closer to matchmaking, where it would be the parents or a relative say, we found someone who would be a great husband. You should go out with them, see if this works. But the person is, especially post-war, always free to just say, oh no, this didn't work out. I don't think I would marry this person.
So,
今日はよかったろ、七里浜。
茅ヶ崎のまで行っちゃったの。
そうかい。うん。お前、服部さんどう思
どうって
う？服部だよ。
いい方じゃないの。
うん。ああいうのは、テイストしてどうなんだろ
いいでしょ、きっと。
う。いいかい？
優しいし。
そうか。そうだね。
私好きよ、相方。
おばさんがね、どうだろうって言うんだけど、
何が？
お前をさ、服部に。なんだい？どうしたんだい？
おもらいになるのよ。決まってんのよ。とても可愛くて綺麗な方。第一だとして3年したの。
そうか。
いずれお父さんにも話あるわよ。その方よく知ってんのよ、私。
そうか。
お祝い何あげようかと思ってんだけど。
うん。そうかい。結婚すんのかい？服部に。
ねえ、何がいい？
うん。決まってたのかい？お嫁さん。
ええ。
So Noriko figured out they were trying to set her up, and she's like, oh, I know he's married, I'll go out with him, and kind of pulls that later. So there is a mischievous to her, and again, there is an agency with these characters. And again, even though the routes they are choosing might be more traditional, there is still the idea of they are making these choices for themselves rather than simply just being guided into it by their family. So we have iconic duos in cinema. We have De Niro and Scorsese. We now have Jordan Peele and Daniel Kaluuya. And in Japan, also in Japan, there's a Kurosawa and Toshiro Mifune, and actually it's Akira Kurosawa and a number of people, but for Ozu, it is Ozu and Setsuko Hara, even though she was only in 6 of his films. And Todd, do you have the name of the one actor who has been in all of Ozu's films?
One moment, let me see if I can pull up quick.
Yeah. So he's the father, I believe he's the father in Tokyo Story, and even...
Yeah, it's on the tip of my tongue, and I have to look it up just to make sure I say it right.
That's the one downside of doing these programs, is I have to really make sure I'm pronouncing everything correctly. So Hara and Ozu made 6 films together, and if you watch them all, you are seeing sort of the Hara move through different moments in a woman's life. You have Late Spring, which we just saw a clip from, Early Summer, which is a similar movie where she once again plays a girl as like, I don't want to get married. And unlike Late Spring, she kind of sticks to her guns a little bit more in Early Summer. And you have Tokyo Story, where she is a widow with no children. Tokyo Twilight, which is one of Ozu's darker films, where she's a divorced mother, or a mother contemplating a divorce and wondering if she should try to stay with her husband or not, and stay with her family or not. Late Autumn, where she plays a mother trying to maybe ask one of her daughters to get married. And then finally the End of Summer, where she is a widowed mother contemplating remarriage. And there are people who will now criticize Ozu, the idea of like, oh gosh, the only women he could ever write were like mothers or wives, which number one is not true. There is he has young women, he has women trying to really wrestle with the new world they live in. Tokyo Twilight, there is the character of Setsuko Hara's younger sister, who is having an affair with a married man, gets pregnant. She has to terminate the pregnancy. And, again, a fairly modern plotline for an Ozu film. Or if we go back to Late Spring, there is a woman in there who is divorced. She doesn't have children, and she's not portrayed as a scorned woman or a bad woman. If anything, she is emblematic of the future, and she's actually a character that the father speaks with at the end of the movie. It is the divorced woman character who kind of encourages him to be like, it's going to be okay. I know you're worried about your daughter going to a new life, but she'll figure it out. We all figure it out. I think he has an idealized view of women in a way, but I think the women that he creates are far more nuanced than I think some Western viewers give him credit for. So his post-war films, and particularly the ones that he had with Hara, were dealing with the changing families, the changing roles in Japan, especially when it came to women. And they are ones who were looking to balance like the traditional roles with the independence. And as I said earlier, they always came down on the side of let's look to the future rather than things were just so much better in the past. In fact, in many cases of his films, they're like, no, it wasn't. There are whole conversations of like, well, at least now I can choose to not get married. Isn't that better for me? And even older women agreeing like, yes, it is, but still kind of going, you should kind of get married at some point. I mean, keep in mind, these are movies made in the 1950s. So I noticed I mentioned the Noriko trilogy, which is Late Spring, Early Summer, and Tokyo Story. In all three films, Hara plays Noriko. She's a young woman who refuses marriage, and she also refuses marriage in Tokyo Story, but as a widowed woman. But what Tokyo Story explores is how she's really putting off marriage because she's trying to hang on to a past that is no longer there. And what's interesting about these movies, for as much as Hara became like the emblematic picture of an Ozu woman, in some ways just the picture of the modern Japanese woman, according to her biographer, he was not a super big fan of that. And if anything, she wanted to get the meteor roles, like the ones she had with Kurosawa, a little more than she could with the ones she had with Ozu. But still, she went back to working with him, and by all accounts, in terms of a creative team, they understood each other, they understood how to work together. So there was no animosity between the two. And so this quote is from Ozu. Every Japanese actor can play the role of a soldier, and every Japanese actress can play the role of a prostitute to some extent. However, it is rare to find an actress who can play the role of a daughter from a good family. Again, a little bit of a loaded statement now, but that was how he described Hara, like this idea of she is the idealized version of what I am trying to portray in my films. So speaking of Kurosawa, Hara did get a chance to collaborate with him again for his adaptation of the Russian novel The Idiot. So unfortunately, this movie was not well received, and it was the final time she had collaborated with him. it was a bomb at the box office, not well received critically, and her brother-in-law was like, it's best to not work with him again, just for the sake of not having another box office embarrassment. But it is probably one of her most interesting roles, because rather than playing this wide-eyed ingenue trying to navigate the world, she's a much darker character. She's meaner, she snaps at people. And what I want you to pay attention to is, we saw the kind of girlish giggle she gave when it's like, oh no, the guy I went to see is engaged. Pay attention to her laugh in this next clip. Oh, sorry. We'll do that and then get back to this. So.
仲間あれおよしなさい。大野さんも加山さん。東畑さんを責めることはありません。私、二度と元の才に収まる気はないんだから。なんていうかあなたの？私はただで、あなたを自由にしてあげると言っているんですよ。もちろん、例の60万円はしまっておきなさい。いいえ、このうちも何もかも、みんなあなたに返してあげますよ。はい。そのままはずだ。本当に。悪かった。忘れなかった。娘たち。わしは違う。わしはもう世間のマークなんか気にせん。わしはお前と結婚する。
So we see that for as much as she can play the daughter from a good family, she absolutely had the ability to play someone a little meaner. And she did get to do that, but the films that she was able to do that in are only things I could read about. There are films where she played, warlords' wives, scheming women. She played a gambling addict in one. Unfortunately, these are films that have just not come over to the United States. So, as I said earlier, she got the term the Eternal Virgin. And a lot of that came from the fact that she was over 25 and never married, never had any public relationships. Again, granted, this was, at a time where it was very expected that you remained chaste until marriage. And a lot of actors did not date publicly, as opposed to what you would see in Hollywood. So she kind of had this image of just being this chaste, pure woman, but that was not something she wanted to cultivate for herself. And if anything, it became kind of a mean moniker at first. So this is from Professor Yuka Kano again. She said the early virgin moniker came about, quote, around 1946, prior to when Hara began appearing in Ozu's films. So a lot of people attribute the Eternal Virgin moniker to just because she was in Ozu's movies. It predates that. A film producer referred to her in that way in a magazine called Movie Fan, which I believe was the first time. In conjunction with representing the Noriko characters, Hara later began to take on a kind of desexualized aspect, which progressively turned into a deification. And finding out that privately Hara was really not happy with these and arguably wanted to get darker roles like the idiot, it actually kind of, I think, makes perfect sense. But when you are working within a system and you still want to work, you do what you can. So as I said, her brother-in-law, Kumagi, heavily involved in her career, really guided her, and in some ways guided her for the better. When she was younger, by all accounts, he was very protective of her, kept her away from far more predatory people, and did guide her towards good roles. However, he talked her out of some roles that he thought wouldn't be good for her, including, and I said we'd come back to this, the lead in Kurosawa's Rashomon. Now, could you imagine, Todd, what would Setsuko Hara and Rashomon be like? Can I go, speaking of the multiverse, can I go see the universe where that movie exists?
I mean, based off what I've seen of her in The Idiot, it could work, but for an audience that's familiar through a lot of her Ozu work, that would be a jarring switch.
It would be a brain break. Although I would like to see a world where we would get to see Setsuko Hara and Toshiro Mifune just play off of each other. And there's also been speculation that the reason he was like, "Ooh, don't work with him," because before Rashomon, his movies were iffy in terms of their box office revenue. But if you are familiar with the story of Rashomon, it's, I think, almost certain that the reason he cautioned her away from that role was because it would not fit her brand. So move on to Tokyo Story, which is probably her most famous film, Yasujiro Ozu's famous film, and the movie that introduced both of them to world cinema. Although sadly, it did not reach the United States until 1972, almost 20 years after the film was made, and is very loosely inspired by a 1930s American film called Make Way for Tomorrow. Although Ozu himself never saw the film, only the screenwriter did. But it is about an elderly couple who are trying to connect with their children in post-war Japan, and really finding no support and connection from their biological children. The only one that really cares for them at all is their saintly daughter-in-law, Noriko, played by Setsuko Hara. If you have not seen this film, I would recommend doing so. I believe the library has a copy. It is a beautiful, heartbreaking film. There's a reason it is consistently in the top 10, top 20 of the greatest movies ever made. I really don't want to spoil this film too much. But it's a beautiful film. It's in a way, especially considering there's conversation about found family and who you form your bonds with. There's a reason this film still resonates. It was a big hit in Japan, and it did find an audience in London and France in the later 50s, but it really started to find attention in the West in the 1970s, when in the wake of Kurosawa's films coming over, people are like, well, what else is Japan making? Oh, cool, this movie from 20 years ago. This is really good. So this is going to be a clip, our final clip of the night, from Tokyo Story, where Noriko's talking to her father-in-law. Sadly, the mother-in-law has passed, and it is them having a conversation again about looking forward to the future and just the sadder thoughts that in many cases these characters, and in Japanese society, they would keep to themselves and put on a happy face because they did not want to burden their family members with these innermost thoughts.
お母さんも喜んだったよ。東京であんたんとこへ泊めてもらおうて、いろいろ親切にしてもらおうて。
いいえ、何もお構いできませんで。
いやあ、お母さん言うとったよ。あの晩が一番嬉しかった言うて。私からもお礼を言うよ。ありがとう。
いいえ。
お母さんも心配しとったけれど、あんたのこれからのことなんじゃがな。やっぱりこのままじゃいけんよ。何にも気兼ねはないき。ええとこがあったらいつでもお嫁に行っておくれ。もう庄司のことは忘れてもらおうていいんじゃ。いつまでもあんたにそのままでおられると、かえってこっちが心苦しゅうなる。困るんじゃ。
いいえ、そんなことありません。
いや、そうじゃよ。あんたみたいなええ人はない言うて、お母さんも褒めとったよ。
お母様、私を買いかぶってらしたんですわ。
買いかぶっとりゃしんよ。
いいえ、 私そんなおっしゃるほどのいい人間じゃありません。お父様にまでそんな風に思っていただいてたら、私の方こそかえって心苦しくて。
いやー、そんなことはない。
いいえ、そうなんです。私ずるいんです。お父様やお母様が思ってらっしゃるほど、そういつも庄司さんのことばかり考えてるわけじゃありません。
ええんじゃよ。忘れてくれて。
でも、この頃思い出さない日さえあるんです。忘れてる日が多いんです。私、いつまでもこのままじゃいられないような気もするんです。このままこうして一人でいたら、一体どうなるんだろうなんて、夜中にふと考えたりすることがあるんです。一日一日が何事もなく過ぎていくのがとっても寂しいんです。どこか心の隅で何かを待ってるんです。ずるいんです。
いやー、ずるーはない。
いいえ、ずるいんです。そういうこと、お母様には申し上げられなかったんです。
ええんじゃよ、それで。やっぱりあんたはええ人じゃよ。正直で。
とんでもない。
これはお母さんの得意じゃけれどな。今じゃこんなものも流行る前が。お母さんがちょうどあんたぐらいの時から持っとったんじゃ。肩にもろうてやっておくれ。
でも、そんな。
ええんじゃよ。もろうといておくれ。いやあ、あんたに使うてもらや、お母さんもきっと喜ぶ。
So we watch this scene, and this is a scene that comes late in the film. Noriko, who has been kind of portrayed and presented again as this saintly daughter-in-law, she finally has this moment of breaking. And it's not as if the saintly daughter-in-law is all an act. She truly does care about these people. And she, throughout the film, she's like, you took care of me. Shoji, their son, died in the war. They took care of her, treated her like she was their own daughter. And she does care for them because she wants to. But we do see finally, and in this film, it was fairly groundbreaking at the time to see a person just go like, I essentially, I am not okay. There are some days I know that what society tells me I'm supposed to mourn my lost husband until the day I die, or I'm supposed to just go find someone else right away. For her to say, sometimes I don't think about this man that I loved for years, and sometimes I'm not sure what I want to do, and I feel that there's something, I don't know what, was fairly revolutionary. And sometimes you might not think that something like that can just come from a conversation. And it is a part why this film endures so much, because I think everyone can see themselves a little bit in Noriko in this conversation, almost the idea of that break of, you know what, I'm really not okay right now. And in Japan, the idea of politeness, of manners, of not being too loud and boisterous and histrionic. For this, Setsuko Hara quietly sobbing is almost the equivalent of, I don't know, Shirley MacLaine's breakdown in terms of endearment. But again, I highly recommend Tokyo Story. Todd, you've also seen Tokyo Story. It's one of the few films that has made you cry, I believe.
It's got that distinction.
It's that and Old Yeller and Grave of the Fireflies.
Well, everyone cries at that one.
Yeah, oh man, you ever want to just cry so much you're dehydrated, watch Grave of the Fireflies. It's about two orphan children at the tail end of the war in Japan and World War II. Not a happy film. So the final film that she does with Ozu, and one of her final films in her filmography, is The End of Summer. And it kind of dovetails with one of the other later films with Ozu, Late Autumn, where she's no longer a young girl trying to figure out what to do with her life. She's no longer a young widow. She's now a mother. So again, the evolution of Setsuko Hara, daughter, widow, mother. At least in Ozu's film, because there's other ones where she played, again, her final war, Chushingura, she is a character in the 47 Ronin. Again, that's the movie I'm like, oh, I wish we could get that over here. But this is a character who, she's widowed, she is once again a daughter-in-law, but rather than being fearful of marriage and fearful of what could come if she remarried, she's like, I'm open to this. She also, very notably, has a job outside the house. She works in an art factory. So, not art factory, an art gallery. But we're now seeing early 60s, the roles of women are changing yet again. And if you look to her right, the actress is wearing modern clothing at this point, where she's in a yukata. So this is also, this is not only her penultimate film, it's Ozu's penultimate film. He died in 1963 of, was it liver failure, Todd?
Let me double check on that.
Yeah, I believe it was liver failure. Ozu died fairly young, I believe in his early 60s or maybe late 50s, as opposed to Kurosawa and people like Shohei Mamura, Ken Ochigawa, who were, I think, at least all made it to their 70s. Kurosawa, I think made it into his 80s. So now comes her retirement. So in 1963, and unfortunately, I could never find the exact date of when she retired. I searched a number of places for it, and I could never find anything that verified the date, only the year. At the age of 43, and she was still in demand. Again, she'd come off of another Ozu film, which was a hit. The 47 Ronin film was a hit, but she decided, that's it, I'm done. She calls a press conference after over 100 films to her name, and just says, I'm done acting. By the way, I didn't really like acting. I just did it to support her family. And she retires to Kamakura, where Ozu spent the final days of his life and was buried. Again, I think supporting that theory that despite her weariness with some of the roles that Ozu would give her, they had a professional and very likely a very personal respect for each other. So she retires and pretty much just withdraws from public life. Again, hence these comparisons to Greta Garbo. We have Greta Garbo, I want to be alone. Well, Setsuko Hara one-ups that with, by the way, I hated this job. It's very, I have like an image of her. There's a joke in 30 Rock where an airline is just canceled. Not just the flights are canceled, the airline is canceled. But as the person's leaving, she just goes, by the way, I hate your guts, Karen. And I'm just imagining Setsuko Hara going like, by the way, I hated this job. I don't know, and even her biographers aren't really sure if she truly did not enjoy acting, because if you look at her performances, you can only fake that for so well before the cracks start to show. And whenever she's in her movies, even her later ones with Ozu, she always just has this exuberance and this warmth to her. So there's a lot of speculation that what she was doing was saving face, and not, clearly not giving the true reason as to why she was retiring. So there's a lot of rumors for it. One of the ones that I've heard a lot, and a lot of people like to kind of work into the lore, is that she had actually been a longtime partner of Ozu, because Ozu never married either, and supposedly never had any partners. So he died in 1963, and the idea of when he died, that was it. She was like, I see no reason to act anymore. But the biographer's assertion that she kind of got frustrated with the parts he gave her doesn't really support the idea of, she's like, well, he's dead, I'll never have a great role again. Clearly, I mean, she could have just been like, I'm going back to Kurosawa, he's still making movies. There's other people who thought that she may have been having an affair with Kamagi, her brother-in-law, and when he ended the affair, he stopped being her manager, and she was like, well, I'll never have a career again. But evidence to that really doesn't add up, because if anything, she helped rehab his career post-war, and he had her to thank. So the idea of she would be lost without him doesn't really add up. So there is, I'm trying to find the,
While you're looking it up, two things.
oh, go on, sorry.
The actor you're trying to remember for was Chishu Ryu.
We finally found it. In
And
every
Ozu's cause of
Yasujiro
death
Ozu
was
film.
throat cancer.
Throat cancer. All right. I believe he also drank, though. Yeah. Also, speaking of rumors about Ozu, for as much as there were rumors that Ozu and Hara were a long-standing item, there's also been speculation that Ozu was gay, and in post-war Japan, that was far more of a taboo. And I've even heard speculation that Hara might have been a lesbian, which we may never know. Yuka Kano, in an interview, someone asked her about that, and she just kind of said, like, because she's a women's history professor. She's also a queer studies professor at Doshisha University, but she's like, there's no evidence for it. And she's like, I don't think it's really good to speculate like that if we have no evidence. So I don't think there's really anything to the affair theory between the two of them for a number of reasons. But her biographer, the one who wrote The Truth About Setsuko Hara, had this excerpt. Quote, there are several theories and endless speculation on this. It seems like 99 out of 100 people think that it has something to do with her being ashamed of aging in the public eye. But I don't think someone who insisted that that charm was for other people to decide would be that concerned with their beauty fading with age. However, Mariko Okada, Hara's co-star in Ozu's Late Autumn, 1960, gave a reason that I sense is exactly in line with who Hara was. Quote, it's getting harder for her to perform on tatami mats, which, if you're not familiar with those are the mats made of straw. There's not a lot of cushion with them. And if you're sitting on those with a hard floor, it can be very painful. This was something that was reported in a special condition of Asahi Weekly in 2015 when Hara passed away. Having the self-respect to quit over no longer being able to perform simple actions like standing up or sitting down on tatami mats was the way she wanted to retire, and it seemed just like Setsuko Hara. So Hara was a fairly no-frills person, despite being called like a goddess, an eternal virgin, again, a Japan sweetheart type. But she was always just someone who's like, oh, I don't think I'm beautiful. And again, charm is for other people to decide. That is the most amount of evidence we have that it may have just been she was getting older and just felt I can no longer physically do this job. And again, people always like to spin very elaborate theories as to why things happen, but sometimes it's a more boring reason, like a health-related issue. However, we never really knew, because after her retirement, she did not grant interviews and she remained private, not from everybody, but private from the public, until her death on September 5th of 2015. She died at the age of 95 of pneumonia, and her family did not say that she had died until November because they wanted time to privately grieve. By a few accounts, her biographer spoke to her nephew and some relatives. They're like, oh, she had a circle of friends, but she kind of kept to herself. She would read. She would sometimes go to outings, but she really never played up the, I used to be Setsuko Hara, by the way. She just wanted to be a real person. And when you think about it, we think about like some child stars who they spend a good amount of their early life in front of a camera, and then they just decide, okay, I'm done. I'm ready to just be normal. Macaulay Culkin comes to mind, the biggest star in the world at age like 11. And now he just has a wife and kid and pretty much just does, lives quietly aside from the occasional cameo. But she may have just been thinking, I've been acting for almost 30 years. I've been acting since I'm a teenager. I've been in the public eye for this long. Maybe I'm done. Maybe she wanted to live the second half of her life in private, something that she hadn't gotten to do since she was a young child. Although, Todd, you have an interesting story about this, because you know someone who did run into her post-retirement.
So one of the professors that went there when I was in school, he was basically the de facto film professor for several years until his retirement. He was actually the first person I worked about Setsuko Hara from. He was kind of a very vocal proponent for her, and apparently he did get to meet her at one point.
Did he have like anything to say? Like, so number one, where did he meet her and how? And did he have anything to say about her, like demeanor wise?
That I don't remember, unfortunately, off the top of my head, and unfortunately, we did not have the time for you to try and track him down to get that information.
Yeah, I kind of wish you'd told me that a few months ago, but you had the play to focus on. But yeah, no, he had, so the idea of her being just a recluse who lived in a house like Mrs. Haversham does not seem to be true either. It just, by all accounts, it seems to be someone who wanted to live the second half of her life in private, which is, you know, something every famous person has the right to do, because at the end of the day, while they're famous and while they have a public job, they're still people and do have an entitlement to privacy. So what is Setsuko Hara's legacy? I'm in the West. There is just this idea of she's the one Japanese actress everyone knows of, but she's also someone who became representative of the changing woman in Japan, and regarded both in Japan and in the United States as one of the best actresses of her time. And again, Turner Classic Movies has started to highlight her, so there's now a whole new set of people who know who she is and are interested in her work. She's also, if anyone is into animation, there is a great animated feature called Millennium Actress that was directed by the great Satoshi Kon, who, by the way, passed away at 42, if we're talking about gone too soon, and could have had a whole second half of his life. She is one of the two actresses that inspired that film, the other being Hideko Takamine. But if you are interested in her career, I would recommend seeking that movie out and kind of trying to point out like, oh, what is being referenced. And once again, Yoko Kanno kind of has this good quote to summarize her public image, which is in her debut film, Do Not Hesitate. She typified the image of a, quote, pure, sweet little girl, but as she matured, the world began to see her as more emblematic of the modern young woman or quintessential beauty. And there are some people who wondered, like her biographer said that maybe she quit because she wanted the idea of Setsuko Hara to fade. But then there's others who say she quit because she wanted just to have the image of Setsuko Hara be what it was. She wanted control over that image, and she knew the way to keep that image of Setsuko Hara just kind of almost suspended in amber was to quit at that time. And to close out, there's a quote from novelist Shishaku Endo, who wrote the book Silence. I believe he was the one who wrote Silence, which is what the Martin Scorsese film was based on. So he wrote this about Setsuko Hara. We would sigh and let out a great breath from the depths of our hearts, for what we felt was precisely this. Can it be possible that there is such a woman in this world? And the answer is both yes and no. I mean, yes, Setsuko Hara, the person, or item aside, did exist, but there was also this cultivated image, which at the end of the day is just a cultivated image. But in terms of the talented person who was able to create this image and bring these performances out and give performances that inspired these reactions, absolutely, that person did exist. And with that, we have time for a few questions. This actually went, oh no, you can't see the clip, I'm sorry. Switch to the phone to finish the program. Oh, sorry about that. Well, I was about to say, I'm glad we have time for a few questions. I actually thought this would be a much shorter program than it ended up being. So does anyone have any questions or recommendations, like what would the best film be to start with? As I mentioned before, sadly, a bulk of her work is not available in the United States yet. It's pretty much just her Kurosawa and her work with Ozu. And from everything I've heard, I think there are copies of her propaganda work out there, but they're kind of not great. I guess if you're interested in them from a curiosity standpoint.
Did she ever come to the United States at all, do you know?
She had wanted to travel. She never went to the United States, but she did get to go around Europe. And she, from what her biographer said, watched women like Audrey Hepburn, Katharine Hepburn, and that was another thing that inspired her, this idea of like, oh gosh, I wish I could get these kind of roles. And again, she did kind of in her later years start to go with riskier roles again, where she plays 1960 there was a film called Fondoshi Isha, where she plays a married woman who loves to gamble, and when she runs out of money, she gracefully requests that her husband loan her his kimono, which she then pawns off. But that is just one that is unfortunately not available in the States. I mean, getting international movies can be a rights nightmare sometimes. And then the other sad one was like a lot of these are destroyed. Oh, did her being an actress allow her a better life than other women? I would say yes and no, because especially post-war, like she came from money, and even though her family lost it, she had some kind of a cushion, and she was able to make her own money. Her brother-in-law didn't like steal anything from her. But being an actress, as we see in Hollywood and a lot of industries, is not always a guarantee that you are going to be treated well. But what she was someone who was very savvy and very personable. So she knew how to navigate her way through these relationships with people. So she probably had a little bit more freedom than the average Japanese woman, but I wouldn't say that being an actress was the reason why. But that is one where I believe that her biographer would probably have a lot more information. And again, please, can someone translate that book to English so I can read the whole thing?
So if you went to Japan to see these movies, they wouldn't be subtitles either then, huh?
No, not unless
unfortunately,
you do a special screening.
Right, now that's a shame, yeah.
It is. It's again, like this is why a lot of people like Martin Scorsese does the World Cinema Project, and he does a lot of work for film preservation, because it's sad when these works of art and that works by people who've become such just icons in culture are just gone, sadly. But I think Todd, what would you recommend if you needed someone to just get like a quintessential Setsuko Hara performance?
That is a good question. I admit I'm kind of a ringer here because my primary association is largely through Ozu. So,
well, I would probably say Tokyo Story. I mean, it's the most famous, but it's not a good movie, unfortunately, from what you said. But from what I saw going through clips, I really liked her performance in it. It's one
where I wouldn't even say it's necessarily that bad, but it's like, as Kurosawa goes, he has done better. It's one where you feel bad though, because it was very much a passion project for him that just didn't wind up panning out the way he hoped it would.
Okay. Another question: do we know anything about her sister's life, the wife of the brother-in-law? According to Professor Kano, Hara actually had very good relationships with women, and so she never had any animosity with the sister-in-law. And again, I don't think there's anything to the idea of an affair. If anything, the brother-in-law's involvement was more protective in nature. And again, Japan being a patriarchal society, it was the idea of, well, there has to be a man there to kind of guide you and protect you from people. So I'd imagine the sister likely saw it as, oh, my husband is being very good to my sister. By all accounts, yeah, she never had a strained relationship with any of her siblings. All right. One more question. Unfortunately, we do have to go because I have to close up the library. And everyone stay safe tomorrow, by the way.
Are you closed tomorrow?
Yeah, we're closing. Or closed. I think 10 inches of snow is like, yeah, don't.
Absolutely, yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Great show, Liz.
Oh, awesome. So a couple of our upcoming shows, just before we go, we are doing next month, Roger Ebert, finally doing a program on him. I've said it for years. It's finally happening. And of course, I am going to have to play his review of North, which, you know what, if you haven't seen his review of North or read it, don't look it up. Save that for the surprise. Not February. sorry, COVID ruined my brain, I think. May, Todd and I are going to be talking about Star Wars and ranking the series. The good, the bad, the ugly, the prequels. The prequels weren't good. I'm just going to put that out there now. Still
Opinions will be swapped, blood will be spilt.
Yeah, I'm trying to put together a title for June, but what I want to do is look at drag in cinema, but I'm realizing like it's just going to have to be America. But I'm also probably going to bring in television because I want to talk about Pee Wee Herman. So still trying to do that one. If not, Pedro Almodovar is going to be my topic. It's trying to bring this one together. And in July, I'm going to be talking about Hollywood and the Red Scare. Great topic, very interesting period in American history, and you can hear about why I don't think Elia Kazan deserved that special Oscar. I like the man's movies, but I got opinions. Oh, and before we go, August, Todd, you're doing David Lynch with Ellie.
Yep.
Oh, what did you think of Pinocchio winning Best Actor? I can do that quick before I go. I have not seen it yet. We canceled our Netflix account. I could never forgive them for what they did to Glow, but I have other means. But I love Guillermo del Toro. Very happy to see him win. I love that he stands up for animation as an art form and a medium, not just something for children. And it's about darn time stop motion animation got some kind of recognition from the Academy. So overall, very happy with it. My heart kind of belonged to Marcel the Shell in Turning Red, though. But if I will likely see Pinocchio and maybe think differently. All right. Yeah, movie scores. What little I've seen, I'm like, oh, it looks so good. The reason I didn't see it right away is I've just never been that big on Pinocchio as a story. But for Guillermo del Toro, I'll watch it. And I do love that Disney, to kind of counter that, made their own live action remake of Pinocchio, which was terrible and nobody watched. Don't go against Guillermo del Toro, everybody. He'll win every time. All right. Have a great night, everyone.